70s. Literally one of the worst times to be alive. Nixon was president, the Vietnam War was raging, the dollar was devalued, inflation was at an all-time high, and Americans were scrambling to invest their increasingly useless money into anything. Kind of reminds me of today, actually. And if all that wasn't bad enough, we were also in the middle of the biggest gas crisis in history. On October 6, 1973, an Arab coalition led by Egypt invaded Israel to try to take back land that they lost in the last war with Israel. And the Arabs were kicking their tuckuses. The Israelis hadn't been that hard since Sodom and Gomorrah. At first, Nixon didn't want to get involved, which was a smart move, considering the Arabs controlled over 70% of the world's oil reserves, so it was best not to piss them off. But then the Soviet Union, our sworn enemies, started sending supplies to Egypt. And Nixon took that personally. So he sent Israel $2.2 billion worth of emergency aid. And that was pretty much the beginning of the end for the Arabs. With the help of that cash injection, Israel was able to win the war in like 2 weeks, which was a whole 8 days longer than the last war they fought with Egypt. A ceasefire was signed on October 25th, and the Arab states were now 0-4 against Israel. They were pissed. They blamed the US for taking the massive L, so they decided to punish us by cutting off all oil exports to America.
The Middle East war produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
This was not good. This was very not good. Oil prices quadrupled overnight. Americans were waiting in line for hours to get gas, which, if you've ever been to a Costco gas station, might not surprise you, but back then it was a ridiculous concept. And when you finally got to the pump after literal hours of waiting, there was a good chance that there wouldn't be any gas left. Some states imposed restrictions where license plates ending in an odd number could get gas on certain days, and even license plates could get it on other days.
The odd-even system can't do anything about the problem of no gas. Some of the people online here have been in other lines and still don't have a tank of gas.
I've been in 2 gas lines already.
This morning?
This morning.
How long did you wait for the first one?
I've been in both lines over an hour, and I'm out of gas. Dead out.
Driving was becoming almost impossible for the average schmo. We needed a solution, and we needed one fast. So the federal government got together and decided we need to change our infrastructure to be less dependent on cars. Nah, I'm kidding. Add one more lane, bitch. You see, the American auto industry was way too powerful, so any attempt to make a society that was less reliant on cars was never gonna happen. Realistically, there were only 2 options. Number 1, gas had to become cheaper. Now, how do you make gas cheaper? Well, the easiest option, and something the US has done historically, would be to invade a country with a bunch of oil and very politely force them to sell it to us cheaper. But we were getting our asses handed to us by a bunch of rice farmers in Vietnam, so we couldn't really afford another war. Plus, without gas, our fancy tanks and helicopters were pretty much useless, so that was pretty much out of the question. The second option was to make cars more fuel efficient, so all the car companies in America were scrambling trying to come up with something, anything.
The American automobile, for so long the symbol of America's wealth and extravagance, is dying. New cars and used cars stand like shining tombstones in the showrooms and parking lots of the nation's car dealers. The monsters are dying of thirst. The energy crisis is killing them.
Nobody knew it yet, but the solution had already been invented, and it was sitting in some random garage in LA. Some genius had come up with the solution for America's energy needs, and he didn't even know it. Dale Clift was a Korean War veteran who spent most of his time tinkering with motorcycles in his garage. Dale invented something that was unlike any car that had ever come before it. It had a revolutionary design that no one had ever thought of. You see, it had 3 wheels. Okay, so it wasn't exactly cutting-edge technology. In fact, it wasn't even really a car. It was a Honda motorcycle that he combined with a plastic cover into some Frankenstein-like tricycle with a roof. And he called his invention the commuter cycle. which is an awful name, but it didn't matter because old Dale just made this thing for fun. He had no idea that it was going to be the vehicle of the future. That is until Geraldine Elizabeth Carmichael came into the picture. Better known by her nickname Liz, Carmichael worked at the United States Marketing Institute, which helped entrepreneurs market their ideas and get investors. It's kind of like Shark Tank, minus the guy whose wife killed 2 people while driving a boat drunk. Allegedly. Liz had an incredible backstory. She grew up dirt poor on a farm in Indiana, and after working her ass off for years, she got a mechanical engineering degree from Ohio State. After college, she married a NASA scientist who had just recently died and left her to care for their 5 children alone. Luckily, her sister-in-law stepped in to help out, but it wasn't easy. Liz needed a win, and she needed one soon, because the debt from raising 5 kids was piling up. Then one day Dale Cliff pulls up to USMI in his funny looking 3-wheeled vehicle, and Liz was impressed. Right from the first second she laid eyes on it. This was exactly the opportunity she'd been looking for. Not only was this the solution to America's fuel crisis, but it was also the solution to Liz's being broke crisis.
You're fucking poor!
So she tried to buy the commuter cycle off Dale and promised that she would make him rich. At first, old Dale was reluctant, but one thing you gotta understand about Liz is she was a natural-born sales person. She could sell bacon to Ben Shapiro, so it didn't take long for her to convince old Dale Cliff to sign over the rights to his car. After all, Dale had nothing to lose. All the work had already been done on his part. All he had to do was sit back and watch the cash roll in. So the two of them shook hands and Liz wrote Dale a $2,000 check. The next day he went to cash the check and it bounced, but hey, that's okay, because Liz had promised Dale $3 million once the company took off, so a measly $2,000 was nothing in the grand scheme of things, which come to think of it is exactly what my dad said before he bet our entire life savings at the roulette table. After getting the green light from Dale, Liz created her very own company, the 20th Century Motor Car Corporation, which, if you think about it, is a really stupid name because after 1999 the name would be redundant. But she didn't need to worry about that. What she needed now was money. And lots of it. So she spent the next few weeks cold calling potential investors and finally put together a team of rich dirtbags that were willing to finance her automotive dream. Russian oligarchs, Chinese sweatshop owners, mafiosos, it didn't matter as long as they had a checkbook and a pen. Once the bag was secured, the next step was a proof of concept. She needed a prototype to show that this car was legit. So she hired a team of engineers to put something together. And they had a lot of work ahead of them. Dale's original car was a good starting point, but honestly, the thing was kind of a piece of crap. It was good from getting from point A to point B, but what about point C? He had never even considered point C. So the engineers made a few important changes to Cliff's original design. Like, instead of a Honda motorcycle engine, they would use a more powerful BMW one. And the shell of the car would be made out of the same material that NASA uses to build rocket ships. Liz ordered 2 prototypes in a cornea-assaulting neon yellow, so it would be sure to grab everyone's attention from a mile away. While the engineers were grinding away in the sweatshop, Liz was busy getting the word out about her new car, which she named the Dale, after the famous cartoon chipmunk. She was calling up every news station in the country and telling them all about how the Dale was going to save America and finally bring an end to the gas crisis. And the media was eating it up. Newspapers all over the country were talking about the car of the future, which was great because more attention means more investors, and the money was not going to waste. It had only been a few months since Liz started 20th Century, and the company went from a handful of engineers and designers to over 100 employees working at a 150,000 square foot factory in Burbank. And these weren't just ordinary schmucks off the street either. Well, some of them were, but people were leaving their jobs at Mercedes, Ford, and even NASA to go work for Liz. They believed in it that much. And so did America. The hype around this car was unlike anything you've ever seen. It's like if Tupac and Elvis came back from the dead to announce a joint album produced by Kanye. Before the prototypes even had a chance to be tested, one of them was already being offered as a final prize on The Price is Right. But as fascinating as the Dale was, people were almost more interested in Liz herself. First of all, she was extremely charismatic, like cult leader levels of charisma. And honestly, people had never seen a CEO that was a female. These days, every broad with an Instagram account is an entrepreneur, but in the 70s, unheard of. Pretty soon she was being interviewed by big names like People magazine, and she even got mentioned by Johnny Carson himself on The Tonight Show, which for you youngsters out there was like Joe Rogan if he wasn't spliced together using gorilla DNA. So what was so unique about the Dale if people were willing to drop millions of dollars on this concept? It had to be incredible, right? Well, to start out on an obvious note, the Dale had 3 wheels instead of 4, 2 in the front and 1 in the back. And I know what you're thinking, 3 is less than 4, so how can 3 be better? Well, if you remember anything from 7th grade math, you'll know that triangles are the strongest and most stable shape, which supposedly made it impossible for the Dale to tip over. 1 less wheel also took about 300 pounds off the car's total weight. The special spaceship resin that would cover the vehicle was stronger than steel and lighter, making it pretty much indestructible, but also fast as hell. The total weight of the Dale was 1,000 pounds, which is about half the weight of your mom. Most cars at the time weighed at 4,000 pounds. Lighter cars are faster, cheaper, and more fuel efficient. And this was pretty much as light as a car could get. And you know, that stuff was cool and all, but by far the Dale's biggest draw was the mileage. At a time when most cars were getting an absolutely pathetic 11 miles to the gallon, the Dale was getting 70 miles to the gallon. To put that in perspective, a brand new Toyota Prius gets about 56 miles to the gallon. Now, one of these fancy space cars must have cost an arm and a leg, right? Wrong! The Dale retailed at a more than reasonable $2,000. Yes, that's right, I said $2,000. I know. It sounds ridiculous, ludicrous even. But they were gonna sell so many of these mother suckers that it didn't even matter. Once these bad boys started rolling off the assembly line, Liz was never gonna have to worry about money again. But just when everything was going so good, the trouble started. Things were about to get absolutely insane. But not as insane as the prices at GlassesUSA.com, which just happens to be the sponsor of today's video. If you didn't already know, GlassesUSA.com is one of the biggest eyewear retailers in the US. They have thousands of eyeglasses and sunglasses from brands like Ray-Ban, Gucci, Oakley, and more. I usually wait years before I buy a new pair of glasses because they're expensive as shit, but GlassesUSA.com is way cheaper than retail. I happen to be wearing a pair right now. You guys probably noticed that I look 5% sexier in this video. These are the Muse Merrills, and I also got myself a pair of these here sunglasses, the Muse Elliots. I wore these to the grocery store the other day, and I'm not exaggerating when I say no less than 14 women asked for my phone number. Now, the thing that usually sucks about shopping for glasses online is that you can't try them on, and it's hard to figure out what would look good on you. But GlassesUSA.com has a virtual try-on feature, and it works pretty dang well. They also have a quiz that you can take that will match you with the perfect pair of spectacles for your face. Right now, GlassesUSA.com is offering an exclusive discount just for my audience, and it's for a limited time only. So click the link in the description of this video for more details. And thank you to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring this video. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, that's right. Liz was about to get into a lot of hot water. She had been promising that a lot would get done in a very short amount of time, like an unrealistically short amount of time. And she was putting a lot of pressure on the people who were actually making her cars. So the engineers rushed out 2 prototypes as quickly as possible. And they were complete dog shit. Only one of these things was even a little bit functional. It had all the right parts in it and everything, but it could barely even drive straight. The other one was basically held together by 2x4s and duct tape. And these problems were only made worse by the oil crisis, which caused like a chain reaction that made it super difficult to get their hands on the materials they needed. Instead of the rocket ship casing that they were touting, they used regular old shitty plastic. Liz was warned multiple times that the prototypes were nowhere near ready to be shown to the public. Despite this, she decided to showcase the quote-unquote working prototype to a team of potential Japanese investors. During the demonstration, the car had tipped over. The untippable car had tipped over. This was the most embarrassing automotive showcase in history. Okay, maybe the second most embarrassing. Liz was understandably frustrated with all these setbacks, and she started thinking maybe somebody was trying to sabotage her. She thought maybe the big 3, aka General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, had something to do with all these manufacturing issues. You see, Liz had been talking mad shit about them to the media, and let's be honest, the Dale had the potential to completely upset the whole industry. And it's not like these auto companies don't have a history of doing shady stuff to eliminate competition, so it wasn't too much of a stretch, honestly. Oh, and what about Big Rubber? They also had a cause to sabotage the Dale. After all, if 3-wheeled cars became the norm, then their profits would go down by 25%. But at the end of the day, Liz decided not to worry about it. If the biggest car companies in the US were trying to sabotage her, then that just meant that she was doing something right. They would work out the kinks eventually, and Liz was going to be the next Henry Ford, except slightly less anti-Semitic. But pretty soon, the big three were going to be the least of her worries. Even though there was a ton of issues behind the scenes, Liz kept making more and more outlandish claims about the deal. She claimed to have driven it into the ocean and back with no issues. She also said that she drove it straight into a wall at 40 miles an hour, and there was no damage to her or the car. Oh, and also, apparently it was bulletproof. She shot it with a 9mm and the bullets bounced right off of it. Keep in mind, she was saying all this stuff while knowing that the prototype couldn't even take a left turn without flipping over. But people were so excited about this vehicle that they couldn't even see that there were more red flags in a Chinese parade. Because at the end of the day, Liz Carmichael wasn't selling a car, she was selling a dream. Millions of schmucks from all over the country wanted to throw their hard-earned cash at Liz to get in on the dream early. And who was she to refuse? She was taking orders for cars that weren't even close to being ready for production. Like, these cars had barely been tested, the engineers were struggling to get them to work, and she was selling thousands of pre-orders. This wasn't a freaking video game, okay? This was a whole ass car. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, what's the problem with that? Car companies do that all the time. Well, the issue is that the money that she got from the pre-orders was supposed to go into an escrow account, and it was supposed to be fully refundable. But Liz was funneling all that cash back into the business, which is highly illegal, especially in California. And on top of that, she was also selling stock in the company, which was useless because they didn't even have a license to sell it. So the California Securities and Exchange Commission finally decided enough was enough, and they started coming down on Liz hard. So Liz moved her whole operation to Texas, where fucking over consumers isn't as frowned upon. In fact, the governor himself invited Liz to bring 20th Century Motors to Dallas. But before she could move, the district attorney charged Liz with grand theft. The SEC had been investigating her for a few weeks at this point, and what they found was pretty incriminating.
Upon entering, I discovered the factory were nothing. The hangars were absolutely empty, no tools, no machinery, nothing but a little dirt on the floor. So they actually did not have a factory that they were representing they had. Upon inspection of this vehicle, it was not a viable vehicle at all. It had no engine. 2x4s were holding up the rear wheel. The accelerator was just sitting on the floor. It wasn't even attached. The windows were not safety glass. They would bend back and forth. The doors were put on by regular door hinges like one might find on a house door. The vehicle just absolutely did not exist.
Yeah, things were not looking too good for Liz, and believe it or not, it gets even worse. On January 22nd, 1975, 20th Century Motor Car Company's head of PR was shot in the back of the head 4 times execution style by another employee. Turns out that both of them had done time in the same prison. In fact, they were cellmates. And I guess the guy who shot him still held a grudge. So yeah, it wasn't just Mercedes engineers working at this company. There were also criminals who Liz probably owed favors to, peppered in there. After this incident, the FBI started getting involved. And they weren't the only ones. All these shenanigans attracted the attention of somebody much worse than the CIA, FBI, NSA, and KGB put together. Tucker Carlson. Dad. And no, I'm not joking. Tucker's dad, the appropriately named Dick Carlson, had been feeling that something was off about old Liz Carmichael, so he got a team together and started his own little investigation. And what he found was shocking. Turns out that Geraldine Elizabeth Carmichael was a fraud, a fake, a big fat phony. See, everything we knew about Liz was a complete lie. First of all, she was never married to no NASA engineer. It turns out she was married to a lady. Yeah, remember earlier when I mentioned Elizabeth's sister-in-law? Yeah, that was actually her wife. But hey, it was the 70s, okay? Same-sex couples weren't as accepted as they are now, so it makes sense that she would lie about that. That's no big deal, right? Well, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Liz also claims that she not only had a mechanical engineering degree from Ohio, but she had a master's from Miami State, which is complete bullshit. She did have a bachelor's degree, but it was from DeVry. And as a fellow DeVry alumni, I don't understand why she decided to lie about that. There's nothing wrong about going to DeVry. But wait, there's more. Turns out that Geraldine Elizabeth Carmichael didn't always go by that name. In fact, just a few years before, She was known as Geraldine Michael. Oh, and she also used to be a dude. Geraldine was a notorious con artist. He had a rap sheet longer than your mom's body count, going all the way back to the 50s, where he was arrested in Germany for deserting the army and leaving behind his first wife with their 2 young kids. In 1954, Geraldine married again and started working a bunch of odd jobs where he was constantly getting in trouble for scamming people. Jerry and wife number 2 were constantly moving because he would inevitably piss off the wrong people and they'd be forced to skip town. Fast forward to 1961, Jerry was now on his 5th wife and had more kids than Nick Cannon. At some point, Jerry started his own newspaper, and one day he realized, hey, wait a minute, we can use the newspaper printers to print money. So he started printing and distributing fake money through a front company. But it turns out the money wasn't very convincing because on August 4th, 1961, Jerry was arrested by the Secret Service on counterfeiting charges. But he jumped bail with his wife and kids and went on the run again. So not only were the feds after him, but now so was the mob. Jerry owed money to a mobster named Tony Tennis Balls Gabagoolio. You see, Jerry had been borrowing money from the mob, and now that his whole counterfeiting scheme fell apart, he had no way of paying it back. And let me tell you from experience, life on the run is not as fun as it sounds. Moving every few weeks, using fake identities, and living in constant fear of getting caught is no way to live. Eventually, Jerry got sick of it and decided to do the unthinkable. He was going to turn himself into the police, serve his time, and come out a law-abiding citizen. Nah, I'm kidding. He faked his own death. He crashed his car into a tree, splattered his blood all over the inside, and filled it full of bullet holes, and then ran off. And the cops fell for it, which sounds unlikely, but you gotta remember, this was the 60s, so they were very likely drunk on the job. Now, even though the death was staged, Geraldine Michael did die that day, and soon he would be reborn as Geraldine Elizabeth Carmichael. And by 1970, Elizabeth had moved with her family to California, where she would start her new life. Her new life. Now, none of this was public information, only a handful of FBI agents knew. One of them leaked it to Dick Carlson. And when our boy Dick found out, he was talking about that shit 24/7, okay? Dick believed that Liz's transition was a cover, nothing more than a way to hide from her criminal past, which I guess made sense in that context, but she was taking hormone injections and even cut her balls off in Mexico, which I think we can all agree is a step too far if you're just trying to conceal your identity. But even though Liz was a woman now, she was still a hardened criminal. That's one thing that never changed. By February of 1975, her crimes finally caught up to her. The feds decided that the Dale was a big scam, and she was wanted for 31 counts of fraud. But when the police came to Liz's house to arrest her, she was already long gone. I guess muscle memory kicked in and she fled the state with her wife and kids, but they couldn't get away for long. In April, the FBI tracked Liz down to some bungalow in Miami and took her to jail. During the trial, Liz proclaimed her innocence. According to her, the Dale didn't suck as much as everyone thought it did. She said they could make it work. They just needed more time. The only thing she was guilty of was trying to save America, and Ford, GM, and Chevy were all colluding to throw her in jail because she was a threat. She really believed that too. Halfway through the trial, Liz decided to drop her court-appointed lawyer because she thought he was a spy getting paid off by the Big Three. And she started representing herself, which is never a good idea. But she had spent the last few months studying the law, and she was charismatic as hell. If anybody could convince a jury that they were innocent, it was Liz. On January 24th, 1977, she was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, during her trial, Liz had been staying in a men's jail, and as you can imagine, she was not having a good time. She was desperate not to go back there. But all of her assets were frozen, so she didn't have any bail money. Luckily though, some kind stranger put up the $50,000 she needed for bail. Now it turns out this guy didn't just bail her out because he liked her car. He was a producer for a crime show and wanted to buy the exclusive rights to her story. Liz agreed and she was let out on bail. But she had no intention of going to prison. She wasn't done fighting just yet. So she tried appealing her sentence, but it didn't work. So she tried again, and again, and again. After 4 failed appeals, Liz was out of options. On December 4th, 1980, she was scheduled to go back to court for her final sentencing, but she didn't show up. In a sequence of events that absolutely nobody could have predicted, Liz skipped sentencing and went on the run with her family for the 749th time. So she disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. But wait! The video still isn't over. Fast forward almost 10 years to 1989. Nobody's seen Liz in over a decade. Then, on April 5th, a new episode of the show Unsolved Mysteries premiered. And one of the mysteries involved the disappearance of a certain large woman who had defrauded investors with her car company.
Liz Carmichael's car, the Dale, turned out to be a sham. Was this a case of someone simply failing to live up to their dreams? Or did Liz Carmichael deliberately set out to swindle millions from naive investors?
Up until this point, people had forgotten all about Liz, and Dale just went back to being your grandpa's name. But some people in a small town in Texas started noticing that this Liz Carmichael lady looked an awful lot like the local flower shop owner, Kathy Johnson. Come to think of it, Kathy came to town not too long after Liz Carmichael went missing. Probably just a coincidence though, I mean, what are the odds of that? But somebody decided to call in a tip to the authorities anyways. After all, Liz had a reward on her head, so why not try and collect some free money, right? So the FBI pulled up to the flower shop and holy shit, it was her. It was Liz Carmichael. Just 2 weeks after the Unsolved Mysteries episode aired, police arrested Elizabeth Carmichael again. But this time she would not be eligible for bail. Now, this could have gone extremely bad for Liz, but I guess the cops were just sick and tired of chasing her around all over the place, and she was super old by this point. So, despite committing more crimes than Franklin the Turtle, Liz was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, and she got out after just 2.5, which in the grand scheme of things isn't so bad. After that, she lived a quiet life with her family. Oh, and by the way, the name of the small town in Texas where Liz was arrested? Dale.